My name is Petra Whitlock, and 6 months after I stopped sending my parents money, I found out they'd been telling everyone in my hometown that I disappeared. Not that we were estranged. Not that I'd cut them off. Disappeared. As in, nobody knows where their daughter is. Please pray for our family. I want you to sit with that for a second, because I sat with it for a long time too, in my car, in a parking lot, with my phone shaking in my hand, trying to understand how the people who raised me could look their neighbors in the eye and say something like that about a daughter who was very much alive, working, paying taxes, answering my own phone every single day. Quick bit about me before we go further. I'm 40 years old, an architect in Columbus, Ohio, single, no kids, and for over a decade I send a portion of every single paycheck back home to my parents in a small town called Millhaven, about 90 minutes away. I started doing it at 26, right after I landed my first real job, because my father's hardware store had been struggling for years, and because I grew up believing, deeply, that a good daughter helps her family when she can. That belief wasn't something I chose for myself, not really. It was something built into me from childhood, the way my parents talked about family loyalty like it was the only currency that actually mattered, more than love, more than honesty, more than anything I might have wanted for my own life. I sent that money faithfully for 11 years, through raises and promotions and one very lean year of my own that I never mentioned to them, because admitting I was struggling too felt like it would have broken some unspoken rule. And 6 months before this story starts, in the middle of the hardest year of therapy I'd ever done, I finally stopped. Keep that timeline in mind, because it matters more than you'd think. The call that started all of this came from Nadine Ostrander, my oldest friend from Millhaven, the one relationship from that town I never let fade, even after I moved away and built a completely different life. She runs the diner on Main Street, the kind of place where every piece of town gossip eventually passes through the front door. She called me on a Tuesday evening while I was making dinner, and her voice had a strange, careful quality to it that I noticed immediately. "Petra," she said. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to just answer me honestly." "Okay." "Are you okay? Like, are you actually okay right now?" "Nadine, you're scaring me." "Yes, I'm fine." "Why are you asking me that?" There was a long pause on the line, long enough that I set down the knife I was holding and sat down at my kitchen table. "Your parents have been telling people you disappeared," she said finally. Petra, I think it's been almost 4 years now. I only just heard the full story tonight, from Carol at the church, who heard it from your mother directly. They're saying you stopped answering calls, stopped coming home, and nobody in the family has heard from you or knows where you are. People have been praying for you at church, Petra. Somebody organized a candlelight thing for you last spring. I didn't know, I swear to you I didn't know, or I would have called you the second I heard it. I sat in my kitchen holding my phone against my ear, and for a long moment I genuinely could not process the words in the order she'd said them. 4 years. My parents had been telling people I disappeared for 4 years, while I was here, in Columbus, 45 minutes from downtown, still going to the same job every single day, still sending them money every single month, for most of that time, without them ever once correcting the story to anyone. "Say that again," I said, because some part of me was still hoping I'd misheard her. "A candlelight vigil. For me. Last spring, at the church on Delmore Street. Carol has pictures on her phone, Petra. There were maybe 30 people there. And nobody thought to just call me? Ask my mother for my number? I think everyone assumed your mother had already tried everything. That's the whole point of the story they were telling. That they'd tried, and you'd cut them off completely, gone off the grid, wouldn't answer, wouldn't respond. Nobody had a reason to doubt that. Why would they? It's your own parents saying it. That doesn't make sense, I said slowly. I talked to my mother 2 weeks ago. I sent them money every month for years, up until 6 months ago. How can they be telling people I disappeared if we were literally in contact this whole time? I don't know, Petra. I really don't. But Carol showed me a prayer card from the church directory. Your photo's on it. It says missing, last known contact, 4 years ago. 4 years ago. I did the math without meaning to, my mind moving faster than I wanted it to. 4 years ago was around the time I'd started asking my father harder questions about where exactly the money I sent was going, questions he'd always deflected with vague talk about supplier debts and slow seasons at the store. 4 years ago was also, I realized with a slow, sinking feeling, right around the time my mother had started calling me a little less often, a little more carefully, like she was managing something rather than simply talking to her daughter. If you've ever discovered that the people closest to you were living an entirely different version of the truth than the one you thought you shared, I think you already understand exactly the kind of vertigo I felt sitting in my kitchen that night. This is the kind of story we tell here every single day on Com Stories Drama, real families, real secrets, truths that take years to finally surface, and if that's the kind of story that keeps you coming back, go ahead and subscribe right now, and turn on that notification bell, because I promise you, what I found out over the following weeks was so much bigger than I ever expected. I called my mother that same night, my hands unsteady enough that I misdialed twice before I finally got through. Petra. She sounded surprised, and something underneath the surprise that I couldn't quite name yet. Is everything all right? Mom, I need you to tell me something honestly. Have you been telling people in Millhaven that I disappeared? The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I actually pulled the phone away from my ear to check the call hadn't dropped. Where did you hear that? She said finally, and her voice had gone strange, controlled in a way that instantly reminded me of every time growing up she'd managed a difficult conversation rather than actually had one. Nadine told me. She heard it from someone at church. Mom, there's a prayer card with my photo on it. People think I'm missing. It's complicated, Petra. Complicated how? I talked to you 2 weeks ago. You know exactly where I am. You've known exactly where I am every single day for the last 4 years. I can't get into this right now. Mom. My voice cracked in a way I hadn't expected, and I hated it, hated how quickly I'd slipped back into being someone who needed her mother's approval rather than her mother's honesty. Please. I need to understand what's going on. Not on the phone, she said, and there was something in her voice now, something close to fear, that I genuinely never heard from her before, not in 40 years of being her daughter. Come home this weekend. We'll talk. I promise we'll talk. Mom, wait. But she'd already hung up, and I sat there in my kitchen holding a phone gone silent, staring at the half-finished dinner cooling on the stove, trying to understand how a simple, careful question had produced an answer so much more frightened than anything I'd expected to hear. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay awake running through every phone call with my mother over the last 4 years, every slightly too careful answer, every subject changed a beat too quickly, every time I'd assumed her distraction was just stress about the store, and never once considered it might be something else entirely. Something she was actively managing, actively hiding, from the one person she was supposedly protecting by hiding it. By morning, I'd decided. I was driving to Millhaven that weekend, whether they were ready for me or not, because whatever my mother was too afraid to say over the phone, I intended to find out exactly what it was, face to face, no matter how uncomfortable the truth turned out to be. The drive to Millhaven felt longer than 90 minutes. I spent most of it rehearsing questions I never got to ask in the order I'd planned, because the moment I pulled into my parents' driveway on Larkspur Street, something about the house itself told me this wasn't going to be a conversation I could control. My father was on the porch before I'd even parked, standing with his arms crossed in a way that read less like a greeting and more like a man bracing for impact. He'd aged since I'd last seen him in person, more than a year and a half ago now, though we'd talked on the phone plenty in between. His hair had gone fully gray, and there was a stoop to his shoulders I didn't remember, like he'd been carrying something heavy for so long his body had simply adjusted around the weight of it. Your mother's inside, he said, instead of hello. That's it? No, how are you? No, I'm sorry. Just, your mother's inside? Petra, please. Let's do this inside. The house smelled the same way it always had, old wood and coffee and something faintly like the hardware store, a smell I don't think ever fully left my father's clothes no matter how many times my mother washed them. She was sitting at the kitchen table when I walked in, hands wrapped around a mug she wasn't drinking from, and she looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen on her before. Not guilt, exactly. Something closer to exhaustion, the kind that comes from carrying something heavy for far too long. Sit down, she said. Please. I sat, but I kept my coat on, some small, stubborn part of me refusing to settle in, refusing to make this feel comfortable for either of them. I want to know why, I said. Just start there. Why would you tell people I disappeared? My parents exchanged a look, one of those looks married couples develop after decades together, a whole conversation passing between them without a single word spoken. My father was the one who finally answered, though his eyes stayed fixed on the table. When you stopped sending money, he said, we had a problem. A bigger problem than the store. What kind of problem? There were obligations, he said carefully. Things that money was covering that I never fully explained to you. Explained what? Dad, I sent you money for 11 years because you told me the store was drowning. Are you telling me that wasn't even true? The store was struggling, my mother said quickly. That part was real. But not all of the money went to the store. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Then where did it go? Neither of them answered right away, and in that silence I found myself doing something I hadn't done in years, not since I was a teenager desperate for any explanation that made sense of my parents' behavior. I started running through old memories, searching for something I'd missed. A name mentioned once and never again. An unexplained trip my father took every few months to a town an hour away, one he always called a supplier run that never seemed to produce any actual supplies I could remember seeing at the store. A drawer in his office at Whitlock Hardware that had always been locked, one I'd never once thought to question as a kid. I remembered, too, a Christmas years ago when my mother had gone strangely quiet for an entire afternoon after checking the mail, and how neither of them had explained it, and how I'd simply accepted, the way children do, that some things in a family were just never discussed. I need actual answers, I said. Not vague words. What was the money for? My father stood up, walked to the counter, and came back with a folder I recognized immediately, the same kind of manila folder he'd always kept his business paperwork in. His hands weren't quite steady as he set it down in front of me, and for the first time since I'd walked into that kitchen, I saw something in his face that looked less like control and more like a man finally putting down something he'd been holding for far too long. Before I tell you anything else, he said, I need you to understand that whatever you're about to find out, it happened before your mother and I were married. Before you were even a thought. I made a mistake, a long time ago, and I have spent the rest of my life trying to make it right without destroying the family I built after it. My hands were shaking when I opened the folder. Inside were bank statements, years of them, going back further than I could have imagined, showing a recurring monthly transfer, always the same amount, always to the same account, an account that had absolutely nothing to do with Whitlock Hardware. The transfers went back over 15 years. Long before I'd ever sent them a single dollar. Who is this money going to? I asked, though some part of me already suspected the answer would change everything I thought I knew, and some quieter, more frightened part of me almost wished I hadn't asked at all. Her name is Billy, my father said quietly. Wilhelmina Foss. She's 43 years old. He paused, and I watched him force himself to keep going, like a man walking into water he knew was going to be freezing. She's my daughter, Petra. From before I met your mother. The kitchen went completely silent. I could hear the refrigerator humming, the same sound I remembered from being small and hiding in the pantry during arguments I didn't understand as a kid, and for a moment I genuinely thought I'd misheard him. "I have a sister," I said slowly, testing the words, because they didn't feel real yet. "Half-sister," my mother said, and her voice had gone flat, controlled, a voice I recognized as the one she used when she was holding something together by sheer force of will. "I've known for 15 years, Petra. I found out by accident, and I made a decision not to blow our marriage apart over a mistake your father made before we ever got engaged. I chose to manage it instead." "You knew." I looked between them, feeling something crack open in my chest that I didn't have a name for yet. "You've known me for 15 years, and neither of you ever once thought I deserved to know I have a sister?" "It wasn't that simple," my father said. "It seems pretty simple to me. Here's something I want to ask you directly, because I think a lot of you might have a strong reaction to what I just found out sitting in that kitchen. If your own parents told everyone you had disappeared, simply because you stopped covering a debt they never fully explained to you, would you be able to forgive them, once you learned the reason underneath it? What would you have done in my position? I want to know honestly in the comments, because this is exactly the kind of story that gets people talking, and I read every single response. If you're finding yourself invested in what happens next, go ahead and hit that like button, and remember, we release a brand new true story just like this one every single day here on Calm Stories Drama. "When you stopped sending money 6 months ago," my mother continued, her voice tight, "we couldn't cover the payments to Billy anymore. Not on top of the store's debts. And around that same time, Billy got sick. A kidney condition, serious, expensive. She needed help more than she ever had before, right when we had less to give than we'd had in years. So you told the entire town I disappeared." My voice came out sharper than I intended. "Instead of just telling me the truth. Telling you the truth meant admitting your father had a daughter before we married," my mother said. "It meant admitting I'd known for 15 years and said nothing. It meant admitting where your money had actually been going for over a decade. Petra, I was terrified. Of losing you, of losing the life we built, of this entire town knowing something I'd spent 15 years protecting. So instead you decided it was easier to let people think I was missing. To let people organize a vigil for me. To let my own name get printed on a prayer card like I might be dead somewhere, rather than just telling me the truth. Neither of them had an answer for that. I don't think there was one that would have made any sense." I sat there at that kitchen table, staring at 15 years of bank statements, at a name I'd never heard before that belonged to a woman who shared my father's blood, and felt the entire architecture of my childhood shift underneath me, every memory I had of my parents' careful, controlled sacrifice reorganizing itself into something far more complicated than I'd ever understood. I thought about every dollar I'd ever sent them, every time I'd skipped something for myself, a vacation, a nicer apartment, a cushion in my savings I actually felt secure about, because I believed I was helping keep a struggling family business alive. Some of that money had been true. But some of it, for over a decade, had been quietly funding a secret my parents had decided, on my behalf, that I didn't have the right to know about. "Did I ever meet her?" I asked quietly. "Growing up. Was she ever, I don't know, at a distance, at a school event, anywhere?" "No," my father said. I made sure of that. It seemed easier, at the time, to keep the two parts of my life completely separate. I see now how that decision cost both of you something I can't ever fully give back. "Does she resent us?" "Me? I don't know," my mother admitted. "I've spoken to her over the years, quietly, carefully. She's never seemed angry, exactly. Just tired, I think, of being the family nobody talks about." "Where is she now?" I asked. "Billy. Where does she live?" "Ashcombe County," my father said. "About an hour from here." "Does she know about me?" My parents exchanged another one of those looks, and this time my mother was the one who answered, quietly, like she was almost afraid of my reaction. "She's known you existed for years, Petra. She's just never had a reason to think you'd ever want to know her back." I sat with that for a long moment, the weight of it settling somewhere I couldn't quite locate yet, somewhere between grief and something that almost felt like hope, and I realized, sitting in that kitchen surrounded by everything my parents had spent 15 years hiding, that the story wasn't over. It was only just beginning to make sense. "I need her number," I said. "Today." "Petra." "No. You've made enough decisions for me without asking. This one's mine." My father was quiet for a long moment, and then, slowly, he reached for his phone, scrolled through it with hands that were shaking slightly, and read a number aloud while I typed it into my own phone with fingers that weren't entirely steady either. I sat there afterward, staring at 10 digits that connected me to a sister I hadn't known existed 20 minutes earlier, and felt, for the first time since Nadine's phone call had upended my entire understanding of my family, something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief. Something closer to the strange, vertiginous feeling of standing at the edge of a door I hadn't known was there, unsure yet whether I wanted to walk through it, and knowing, all the same, that I was going to. I called Billy from my car in my parents' driveway, because I didn't trust myself to wait until I got back to Columbus, and some part of me was afraid that if I gave myself time to think about it, I'd talk myself out of it entirely. She answered on the fourth ring, her voice cautious, the voice of someone used to unexpected calls not always being good news. "Hello? Billy, my name is Petra. Petra Whitlock." I paused, my heart hammering. "I think you know who I am." The silence on the other end went on long enough that I almost apologized and hung up. Then she let out a breath, slow and shaky. "I always wondered if this call would ever happen," she said finally. "I didn't think it would happen like this, though." "Your dad told you." "He told me. About an hour ago." I'm sitting in my parents' driveway right now trying to figure out what I'm even supposed to feel. "That makes two of us," she said, and there was something in her voice, dry and a little sad, that I found myself unexpectedly drawn to. "I've known about you my whole life, Petra. Growing up, my mom used to point out your school photos in the local paper sometimes, when you'd win an award or something. I used to wonder what it would be like to actually know you instead of just knowing about you." "I'm so sorry," I said, and I meant it more than I think I'd meant anything in years. "I had no idea you existed until an hour ago. If I had known." "It's not your fault," she said quickly. "None of this is your fault, Petra. Please don't apologize for something you didn't do." We talked for almost an hour, sitting in my car outside the house where I'd grown up, learning the shape of a sister's life I'd never known was happening in parallel to my own, an hour away, for 43 years. She told me about growing up in Ashcombe County, raised by her mother Ruth, who'd passed away 6 years earlier. She told me about becoming a hospital administrator, about her husband, about the kidney condition that had started worsening over the last year, the one that had made my parents' support suddenly, urgently necessary right around the same time I'd stopped sending it. She had a warmth in her voice that surprised me, given everything she could have reasonably felt toward a family that had kept her hidden her entire life, and I found myself wondering, listening to her talk, how many times she must have practiced sounding that steady about something that clearly still hurt. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Did you ever try to reach out to any of us?" "Once," she said. "I was maybe 25. I drove to Millhaven, actually parked outside your parents' house for almost an hour, trying to work up the nerve to knock. I never did. I think some part of me was afraid of what it would mean if you all rejected me outright, and another part was afraid of what it would mean if you didn't. I wish you had knocked. I wish a lot of things had gone differently," she said quietly. "But I'm glad we're talking now. Even like this." "I need to ask you something," I said carefully. The money my parents were sending you. Did you know it was coming from me? Indirectly, I mean? Not exactly, she said. I knew it was coming from Roland. I didn't know the specific source, not until things got tighter about 6 months ago and your mother finally told me the truth, that the money she'd been sending had actually dried up because you'd stopped supporting them financially. I want you to know, Petra, I never once asked your father to keep sending money for my whole life. That was his decision, guilt, I think, more than anything. I've made my own way mostly. It's just gotten harder lately, with the treatment costs. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling something shift in how I understood the entire situation. My parents hadn't just hidden Billy from me. They'd used my money, for years, to manage a guilt my father had never processed honestly, rather than ever sitting either of us down and letting us decide for ourselves what kind of relationship, if any, we wanted with each other. If you've ever discovered a sibling you never knew existed, or any secret this big buried inside your own family, I want to hear about it in the comments below, because I think so many of you have stories like this one, quiet things families carry for decades without ever saying out loud. Before we get to how this all resolved, if you're not already subscribed, please do. We release a brand new true story just like this one every single day here on Calm Stories Drama, and there is nothing that means more to me than knowing these stories are finding the people who need them. I drove back to my parents' house that same evening, my mind still spinning from the conversation with Billy, and found both of them still sitting at the kitchen table, exactly where I'd left them, like neither had moved in the hours I'd been gone. I talked to her, I said. For almost an hour. My mother's face did something complicated, relief and fear tangled together. How did it go? She's kind. She's been kind about all of this, more than either of you probably deserve, honestly. I sat back down across from them. But I need you both to understand something. What you did wasn't just keeping a secret. It was making decisions about my life, about my money, about who I was allowed to know, for over a decade, without ever once asking me what I wanted. You're right, my father said, and for the first time since I'd walked into that house, his voice cracked, something raw finally breaking through the careful control he'd maintained his entire life. I've spent 43 years being ashamed of one mistake, and instead of ever fixing it honestly, I just kept finding new ways to hide it. From your mother, until she found out on her own. From you, for your entire life. From Billy, who never got to have a real relationship with her own father because I was too afraid of what it would cost me. And the disappearance story, I said. That was the worst part, Dad. Not the secret itself. The fact that when the secret finally threatened to catch up with you, your solution was to erase me publicly rather than just tell the truth. I know, my mother said quietly. I have thought about that decision every single day since I made it, Petra. I told myself it was temporary, that we'd find a way to quietly correct it once we'd figured out how to cover Billy's costs another way. Every week that went by, it got harder to imagine how to undo it without everyone in this town learning everything at once. So instead you let people think I might be dead. Neither of them had an answer for that either. I spent that night in my childhood bedroom, which my parents had never fully repurposed, still full of old furniture and photographs from a life I'd left behind a long time ago, and I thought about everything Billy had told me, about growing up on the outside of a family that had a whole other daughter, about a father who paid for her existence financially but never once let himself actually be present for it. The following weeks were complicated in ways I hadn't expected. My parents corrected the story in Millhaven, quietly at first, then more directly once Nadine, bless her, essentially forced the issue by asking pointed questions at church that made it impossible for my mother to keep managing the narrative. It wasn't a scandal exactly, not the kind my mother had spent 15 years terrified of. Mostly, people were simply confused, and a little hurt, that they'd been lied to for so long about something so significant. A few relationships in that town never fully recovered. My mother told me once, a few months later, that she thought that was probably fair. I started seeing a financial advisor about setting appropriate boundaries around what, if anything, I'd continue contributing to my parents going forward, something I should have done years earlier, honestly, long before any of this happened. My father sold a portion of the hardware store's inventory and finally, properly, restructured the business's debt, doing the hard, unglamorous work he should have done years before instead of quietly leaning on me to paper over it. And Billy and I kept talking. Slowly, carefully, the way you build something you didn't expect to need building at 40 years old. We met in person for the first time 3 weeks after that first phone call, at a diner exactly halfway between Columbus and Ashcombe County, and I remember sitting across from her, seeing pieces of my father's face in hers that I'd never noticed I was looking for until that moment, the same set to her jaw, the same way of tilting her head when she was thinking, and feeling something settle in my chest that had been unsettled since Nadine's call started all of this. She was nervous, I could tell, fidgeting with the edge of her napkin the same way I do when I'm anxious, a small, strange mirror of a habit I'd always assumed was just mine. We talked for 3 hours that first meeting, well past when either of our coffees had gone cold, trading stories about our very different childhoods, comparing the versions of our father each of us had grown up with, the guilty, distant man who'd sent money but rarely showed up, and the present, if imperfect, father I'd actually gotten to have dinner with every Sunday of my childhood. I always wanted a sibling, Billy told me that day, turning her coffee cup slowly in her hands. Growing up, it was just me and my mom. I used to imagine what it would be like to have someone who actually understood what it felt like to be connected to your dad without really having him. I had him, I said. And honestly, some days it didn't feel that different from what you're describing. She looked up at that, something like recognition passing between us, two women who'd spent their whole lives being shaped by the same man's fear and guilt, in completely different ways, finally sitting across a table from each other, finally being honest. We're still figuring out what this relationship is going to look like. It's not simple, and I don't think it ever fully will be, given everything that happened to bring us here. But for the first time since Nadine's phone call turned my entire understanding of my family inside out, I feel like I'm building something real instead of managing a story someone else constructed for me. If there's one thing I want you to take from this, it's this. Secrets don't actually protect the people we love. They just delay the reckoning, and they usually make it worse when it finally comes. If you're carrying something you've been too afraid to say out loud, I hope this story is a small nudge toward finally saying it, before someone else has to uncover it the way I did. Thank you so much for staying with me through this whole story. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do. We share a brand new emotional true story just like this one every single day here on Calm Stories Drama. Drop a comment and let me know, honestly, would you have forgiven your parents the way I'm slowly learning to forgive mine? And if you want another story about family, secrets, and the truth finally coming to light, there's another one waiting for you right now, and I promise, it will not disappoint. I'll see you in the next one.